She sat alone in a quiet riverside park, grief heavier than the wheelchair beneath her. A uniform approached, calm at first, then cruel. He believed his badge made him untouchable. He believed no one was watching. But down the trail, a former Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd heard the impact. They recognized violence before it spoke. And what happened next would expose a truth power can't hide. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, please subscribe for more. Late autumn settled over Riverside Greenbelt like a held breath. The park lay stretched along the Gallatin River on the edge of Bozeman, Montana, a quiet ribbon of land where cottonwoods leaned toward the water and gravel paths wound through yellowed grass. The sky was a flat, pale gray, the kind that promised cold without drama. Wind slid low along the riverbank, lifting dead leaves and pressing them against benches and railings before letting them fall again. Most people had already gone home. The season had thinned the crowds, leaving the park to those who needed quiet more than company. Near the bend of the river, where the path narrowed and the trees grew closer together, a young woman sat alone in a wheelchair. She wore a long black coat, too heavy for the afternoon, but not heavy enough to feel like armor. Beneath it, a dark dress showed at the hem. Simple, formal, unmistakably the kind worn to a funeral. Her hair, light brown and loosely tied back, had begun to come undone in the wind, strands brushing her cheeks without her noticing. Her face was pale, drawn tight, not with tears, but with exhaustion. The kind that came after grief had burned itself out and left only ash. Her hands rested lightly on the rims of the wheelchair, fingers still, almost careful not to make noise. The chair itself was plain and functional, aluminum frame scratched from years of use, the tires dusted with fallen leaves. She stared at the river, not really watching it, her eyes unfocused, as if the current carried something she could no longer reach. She had been coming here every day since the funeral, since the house felt too empty, since the silence inside it pressed too hard. A little farther down the path, boots crunched softly on gravel. Ethan Cole walked at an easy, unhurried pace, a leash loose in his hand. He was in his late 20s, tall without being imposing, his build lean and functional rather than bulky. There was nothing decorative about him. Everything about the way he moved suggested efficiency. Each step placed without waste, shoulders relaxed but ready, head lifting slightly now and then as his eyes scanned the surroundings without conscious effort. His dark hair was cut short, grown out just enough to soften the sharpness of a military style. His face was clean-shaven, angular, with the faint hollowing under the eyes of someone who slept lightly. He wore a worn canvas jacket, faded jeans, and boots that had seen more miles than most people walked in a year. At his side moved a German Shepherd, large and solid, the color of old smoke and sand. The dog's gait was smooth, head level, ears alert, but not rigid. His eyes missed nothing. Though there was no vest, no visible markings, there was no mistaking him for a pet. He moved like a professional, calm, deliberate, aware. Ethan had named him Ranger years ago, back when names still came easily. Walking the Greenbelt had become a habit since Ethan left active service. Not therapy, not exercise. Routine, something to mark time. Morning and evening, the same path, the same stretch of river. It gave his days edges when everything else felt shapeless. As they passed the bend, Ethan slowed. He had seen the girl before, always in the same place, always alone. She never looked up when people passed, never checked her phone, never fed the ducks, or watched the river with any visible interest. She simply sat as if waiting for something that had already happened. Ethan didn't stare. He was careful about that. But his eyes lingered just long enough to note the dark clothes, the stillness, the way her posture curved inward slightly, as though she were bracing against something invisible. Ranger noticed her, too. The dog's ears tipped forward, his pace slowing by half a step. Not alarm. Curiosity, edged with awareness. Ethan felt the change through the leash before he saw it. "Easy," Ethan murmured, not a command, just acknowledgement. They passed without incident. Gravel crunched, leaves skittered. The girl did not move. As Ethan continued down the path, a familiar sensation settled into his chest. Not concern exactly, recognition. He knew that posture. He had worn it himself once, after the paperwork, after the quiet phone calls, after the world had expected him to resume living as if something essential hadn't been torn out and buried overseas. Ethan had left the Navy SEALs 6 months earlier, officially due to a shoulder injury sustained during a training rotation. Unofficially, it was harder to explain. The injury had healed. The weight had not. Bozeman wasn't home. It was simply where he had landed, a place small enough to disappear in, far from bases and bars full of people who asked questions they didn't really want answers to. Ranger had adjusted better than Ethan had. Dogs lived in the present. Ethan's mind still stalled somewhere else, circling moments he couldn't fix. They reached the end of the trail and turned back. The light had shifted while they were gone. The sky darkened toward evening, and the air sharpened. When they came back around the bend, Ethan noticed movement near the girl. A man in a police uniform walked the path toward her. He was on foot, not in a cruiser. Mid-30s, maybe older. Average height, average build, the kind of man who blended easily into crowds. His uniform was neat, boots polished, duty belt heavy at his waist. He moved with casual confidence, hands resting near his belt, posture loose. Too loose. Ethan slowed again, more deliberately this time. The officer stopped a few feet from the girl's wheelchair. Said something. Ethan couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he could see the way the man angled his body, blocking part of the path. He leaned slightly forward, head tilted, as if expecting compliance. The girl lifted her head at last. Her expression didn't change much. No fear, no relief. Just tired attention. Ranger stopped walking altogether. His body went still, weight evenly distributed, tail low but steady. His ears rotated, tracking tone rather than words. Ethan felt the leash tighten. Not pulled, just ready. The officer gestured toward the girl's chair. One hand moved, palm up, in a motion that might have been interpreted as helpful from a distance. Up close, it looked different, expectant. The girl shook her head once, small, decisive. The officer's mouth tightened, his shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. He glanced around the park, taking in the empty benches, the thinning light, the lack of witnesses. Ethan stopped walking. He didn't move closer. Not yet. He simply stood, one hand resting lightly on the leash, eyes forward. Years of training whispered options into his mind without his permission. Observe. Assess. Wait. Ranger let out a low breath through his nose. Not a growl, but something close enough to raise the hairs along Ethan's arms. The officer's gaze drifted, then landed on Ethan. For a brief moment, the two men looked at each other across the stretch of path and fallen leaves. The officer's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Ethan's face. His expression smoothed into something neutral, almost bored. He said something to the girl again. His hand moved, closer this time. The girl's shoulders tensed, her hands tightened on the wheels. Ethan felt the stillness around him deepen, the way it did before something broke. Ranger's posture lowered by a fraction, muscles coiling beneath his fur. The river moved on, indifferent. Leaves scraped softly across the path. The sky dimmed another shade. And in that quiet, empty park, with the cold pressing in and no one else close enough to matter, the officer took one step closer to the wheelchair. Ethan did not move. Not yet, but every part of him was awake. The officer stopped just far enough away to be polite. Up close, he looked ordinary. Mid-30s, average height, a build softened by years behind a desk rather than on the street. His uniform was clean and pressed, the badge catching what little light filtered through the thinning canopy of trees. His hair was trimmed close at the sides, longer on top and slicked neatly back, as if presentation mattered more to him than comfort. His face held a practiced expression of calm authority, the kind meant to reassure and dominate at the same time. "Evening," he said. His voice was level, professional. "Just doing a routine safety check. We've had a few incidents reported in this area." The girl lifted her gaze to him. Her eyes were dull, rimmed faintly red, but dry. She nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, and then looked back toward the river. The officer waited. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of water moving over stones and the distant hiss of wind through branches. He cleared his throat. "Are you out here alone?" "Yes," she said quietly. He glanced down at her wheelchair, his eyes lingering longer than necessary on the metal frame, the scuffed footrests, the thin blanket draped over her knees. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" She hesitated. The question felt heavier than it should have. Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "Sitting." A faint smile flickered across his face, not kind, amused. "This park closes at dusk," he said, though the sun had not yet fully disappeared. "It's not really safe for someone in your condition to be out here without supervision." Her hands tightened on the rims. "I'm fine." He shifted closer, boots crunching softly on gravel. His presence filled the narrow path, crowding her space without touching her. "I'm just looking out for you," he said. "That's my job." She could feel the weight of him, his uniform, his authority, pressing down on her. Normally she would have nodded again, apologized, done whatever was required to make the interaction end quickly. That had been her instinct for years. Avoid conflict. Stay small. Don't provoke. But grief had stripped something away. "I'd like to be left alone," she said. The officer's expression tightened, his jaw set, the smile gone. He looked around the park again, slower this time, taking note of the empty benches, the absence of witnesses, the lengthening shadows. "You don't have to be rude," he said. "I'm trying to help." "I didn't ask for help." That did it. He exhaled sharply through his nose, irritation flashing across his face. "You people," he muttered, too low for anyone else to hear. "Always acting like the world owes you something." She flinched at the words, though she didn't know why. They landed deeper than the shove ever could. "I said I want you to leave," she repeated, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. His hand moved, not toward her, not exactly, but close enough that she could feel the shift in air as it passed. He reached for the handle of the wheelchair. "Don't," she said. The word came out sharper than she intended. Her heart began to pound. Images flashed through her mind. Hospital corridors, the smell of antiseptic, the quiet room where she had stood beside a bed that would never be occupied again. The officer's fingers closed around the handle. "Watch your tone," he said. "You should be grateful someone's paying attention." She reacted on instinct. Her hand slapped against his wrist, weak but defiant. "Let go." For a fraction of a second, he looked genuinely surprised. Then his face hardened. "Ungrateful," he spat. "I show up, I do my job, and this is how you respond?" Before she could say anything else, he shoved. It wasn't a measured push. It was fueled by anger, by wounded pride. The wheelchair lurched sideways, one wheel catching on a root hidden beneath fallen leaves. The chair tipped. She felt weightlessness for an instant, followed by impact. The ground slammed into her shoulder and hip, the cold shock of gravel biting through fabric. Air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. Pain flared, bright and disorienting. She tasted dirt. The wheelchair clattered as it fell, metal scraping stone before coming to rest on its side a few feet away. She lay still, stunned. The officer stared down at her, chest rising and falling faster than before. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then it vanished, replaced by something darker. "Get up," he said. She tried. Her arms shook as she pushed against the ground, but her strength failed her. Her body refused to respond the way it once had. Panic surged, hot and immediate. "I can't," she whispered. His mouth twisted. "You shouldn't have touched me." He took a step back, then another, as if distance could undo what he'd done. His hand hovered near his radio, then dropped. "Stay where you are," he said. "I'm calling this in." She watched him turn away, his back rigid, his shoulders squared as though bracing himself. Tears finally welled, blurring her vision. Not from pain, but from the familiar, crushing realization that she was powerless here. Somewhere down the path, a leash went taut. Ranger's ears flattened, his body dropping into a low, alert stance. A sound rumbled in his chest, deep and instinctive, vibrating through muscle and bone. Not a bark. A warning. Ethan had stopped walking. The sharp metallic scrape of the wheelchair hitting stone had cut through the quiet like a gunshot. He didn't need to see the scene to know what it was. His body reacted before his mind caught up, heart rate spiking, muscles tightening. "That wasn't a fall," he murmured. Ranger pulled once, hard. Ethan's eyes locked on the figure standing over the girl's prone form, the uniform, the posture, the way the man's back was turned, as if trying to convince himself nothing had happened. A cold clarity settled over Ethan, familiar and unwelcome. This wasn't an accident. Wind swept across the riverbank, scattering leaves and carrying the faint sound of the girl's uneven breathing. Ranger growled again, louder this time, the sound sharp enough to slice through the evening air. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash. Not yet, but every instinct he had was screaming that silence had just been broken, and violence had taken its place. Ethan moved before the officer finished turning around. His steps were steady, unhurried, but they carried weight. Gravel shifted beneath his boots as he closed the distance, positioning himself not between the officer and the girl yet, but close enough that his presence could no longer be ignored. Ranger stayed at his side, leash short, body angled forward, ears pinned low in focused alertness. "Officer," Ethan said. His voice was calm, too calm. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet like a blade. Years of command training lived in that single word. The officer spun, startled. He hadn't expected anyone else to be close enough to intervene. His eyes flicked from Ethan to the dog and back again, quickly recalculating. "This is police business," the officer snapped. "Step back." Ethan didn't move. "I heard the fall," he replied evenly. "That didn't look like an accident." The officer scoffed, masking unease with irritation. Up close, his features were sharper than they'd appeared at a distance. Thin lips, a narrow nose, eyes that darted too often to be confident. There was a faint sheen of sweat along his hairline despite the cold. "She became uncooperative," the officer said. "I'm handling it." Behind him, the girl lay on the ground, one arm curled protectively against her side. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. Dirt clung to the sleeve of her coat. She hadn't tried to move again. Ethan took another step forward, placing himself squarely between the officer and the girl. His posture was relaxed but deliberate, shoulders squared, feet planted. He didn't touch the man. He didn't need to. "Back away," Ethan said. "Now." Ranger let out a low, steady growl. Not aggressive, not frantic. Controlled. A sound that said the situation had already crossed a line. The officer's gaze snapped to the dog. His hand twitched near his radio, then fell. He looked around the park again, more urgently this time. The light was fading fast. The path was empty. No witnesses. "You threatening an officer?" he demanded, though his voice had lost some of its edge. "No," Ethan said. I'm preventing a problem from becoming a crime." Silence stretched between them. Wind pushed leaves across the path, scraping softly against stone. The officer swallowed. His shoulders shifted, tension rippling through him. He took a half-step back, then stopped himself, pride flaring. "I don't need some civilian telling me how to do my job," he said, "especially not with a dog." Ethan met his eyes. There was no anger there, only certainty. "You put your hands on her," Ethan said. "You tipped her chair. That's not procedure." For a moment, it looked like the officer might argue. His jaw worked, words forming and dying behind his teeth. Then his gaze flicked again to Ranger. Too long this time. He exhaled sharply, a sound of frustration more than relief. "Fine," he said. "Handle your friend." He stepped back another pace, then another, increasing the distance between them. His hand came up, finger raised in warning. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice low enough that the girl wouldn't hear. "You think you can embarrass me and walk away?" Ethan didn't respond. The officer's lips curled into something close to a smile. "I'll remember your face." He turned and walked away down the path, boots striking gravel with forced confidence. He didn't look back. Ethan waited until the sound of footsteps faded into the wind before he moved. He crouched beside the girl, careful to keep his movements slow and predictable. Ranger sat automatically, body forming a barrier between them and the path, eyes tracking the direction the officer had gone. "You hurt?" Ethan asked. The girl nodded once, then shook her head, confused by her own answer. Tears streaked silently down her cheeks now, cutting pale lines through the dirt. I can't get up," she said, voice breaking. "That's okay," Ethan replied. "You don't have to." He assessed her quickly, the way he'd been trained. No visible bleeding, no obvious deformities, but shock was a concern. He didn't touch her yet. "I'm going to help you sit up," he said. "Tell me if anything hurts." She nodded again. With deliberate care, he slid one arm behind her shoulders, another beneath her elbow, supporting her weight without lifting. She winced, but didn't cry out. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his warm body lightly against her legs, a grounding presence. Once she was upright, Ethan retrieved the wheelchair, setting it back on its wheels. One tire wobbled slightly, but held. "Can you lean forward?" he asked. She did. He guided her back into the seat, ensuring her balance before releasing his hold. When she was settled, he stepped back, giving her space. She sat there for a moment, staring at her hands. Then her shoulders began to shake. The sobs came quietly at first, then all at once. Deep, ragged sounds pulled from somewhere raw and exhausted. She bent forward, face in her hands, grief spilling out unchecked. Ethan stayed where he was. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He didn't tell her to breathe or that everything happened for a reason. He simply stood there, present, a solid fact in a world that had just proved itself dangerous again. Ranger rose and rested his head gently against her knee. She didn't pull away. Her fingers curled into his fur, clutching as if afraid he might disappear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she didn't know why. "You don't need to be," Ethan said. Minutes passed. The river kept moving. The sky darkened another shade. When her breathing finally slowed, she looked up at him, eyes red and swollen. "Thank you," she said. I didn't know what to do." "You did enough," Ethan replied. He glanced down the path once more, unease settling into his gut. The officer's words echoed in his mind, not as a threat of immediate violence, but as a promise of future trouble. "You should head somewhere safer," Ethan said gently. "It's getting cold." She nodded, wiping her face. "I will." Ethan waited until she began moving down the path before he followed at a distance, Ranger at his heel. The park felt different now. quieter, heavier, as if something unseen had shifted. He knew one thing with certainty. Whatever had just walked away wasn't done. The days shortened, and the park learned a new rhythm. Late autumn settled deeper into riverside greenbelt, thinning the light and sharpening the cold. Ethan found himself walking the path more often, not because routine demanded it, but because it mattered now who occupied the space. The river carried the same muted rush, but the benches were rarely empty anymore, not since she began moving again. Her name was Clara Wynne. She was 24, with a quiet, thoughtful presence that made people lean in without realizing it. Her hair fell just past her shoulders in soft waves, often tucked behind one ear when she spoke. There was a faint scar along her jawline, barely visible unless the light caught it right, a remnant of a life before loss changed her posture. She wore simple clothes, layers chosen for warmth and practicality. And she favored earth tones, as if trying to blend into the season rather than stand out from it. They walked together most afternoons. Sometimes Ethan pushed the chair. Sometimes she insisted on doing it herself, her hands firm on the rims, jaw set with determination that surprised even her. Ranger stayed close, pacing at her side with an unspoken understanding of the new formation. Clara spoke slowly at first, measuring each word. Her brother had been the one constant in her life. Older by 8 years, protective without being suffocating, the person who taught her how to navigate a world that often underestimated her. He had died suddenly. An accident on an icy road, a phone call that rearranged everything. The house they'd shared felt hollow afterward, every room echoing with what wasn't there. "He used to come here with me," she said one afternoon, nodding toward the bend in the river. Said the water reminded him that things kept moving even when you didn't. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt or fill the silence. He had learned, the hard way, that grief wasn't something to fix. It was something to witness. Clara began to laugh again, not loudly, not often, but enough that the sound startled her when it came. She talked about small things, books she liked, coffee she missed drinking outside the house, how Ranger's ears made her smile when they tilted just right. For Ethan, the walk stopped feeling like patrols and started feeling like purpose. The evenings grew darker, faster. One night, clouds pressed low against the sky, smothering the last of the light. The park emptied early, footsteps fading until only leaves and wind remained. Ethan noticed the stillness before he noticed the man. He stood near the trees, half hidden by shadow. No uniform, no badge catching light. Just a figure in a dark jacket, hands tucked into pockets, posture stiff with contained energy. His hair was unkempt now, the slick order of authority gone. Stubble darkened his jaw. His eyes burned with something raw and resentful. Clara saw him too. Her fingers tightened on the wheels. "That's him," she said, voice barely above a breath. The man stepped forward, boots crunching softly. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You make friends fast," he said, nodding toward Ethan. "Thought you'd be smarter than that." Ethan moved without thinking, placing himself between the man and Clara. Ranger mirrored the shift, muscles coiling, body low and ready. "You shouldn't be here," Ethan said. The man laughed, sharp and humorless. "Public park, or do you think you own it now?" He circled slightly, testing angles, gaze flicking between Ethan and the dog. "You cost me," he continued. "You embarrassed me." "No one forced your hand," Ethan replied. The man's face twisted. "You don't get to decide that." He lunged. There was no warning this time, no pretense of authority. His fist came fast, wild with fury rather than skill. Ethan deflected the strike, stepping inside the swing, redirecting momentum with practiced ease. The second punch grazed his shoulder before Ethan closed the distance fully. Ranger barked once. Short, sharp. The man staggered back, surprise flashing across his face as Ethan drove him toward the open path, away from Clara. He swung again, desperation fueling his movements. Ethan absorbed the blow with his forearm, pain flaring, then locked the man's wrist and twisted. Bones strained. A gasp tore from the man's throat. "Stop," Ethan said, voice steady. The man snarled and tried to headbutt him. Ranger surged forward, teeth bared, stopping inches from flesh. The threat was enough. The man froze. Ethan used the opening, sweeping the man's legs out from under him and guiding the fall, controlling the descent so the impact knocked the fight out of him without ending anything permanently. The man hit the ground hard, breath whooshing out. Ranger stood over him, chest heaving, eyes locked. Clara watched, heart hammering, hands gripping the wheels. She felt fear, yes, but beneath it, something new. Control? The man cursed, rolling onto his side. "You think this is over?" he spat. A light flared. A woman stood at the edge of the path, phone raised. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, wearing running gear layered for warmth. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, face flushed from exertion. Her eyes were sharp, alert. "I saw everything," she said. Her voice carried easily. "And I'm recording." The man's bravado collapsed. His gaze darted from the phone to Ethan to Ranger. "Get that thing out of my face," he snapped. The woman didn't move. "Already sent," she replied calmly. Ethan released his grip and stepped back, hands open. The man scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist, breathing hard. He glared at them, hatred etched deep into his expression. "This isn't finished," he said again. But the words rang hollow now. He turned and fled into the trees, footsteps uneven, pride shattered. Silence rushed in to fill the space he left behind. The woman lowered her phone and approached. "You okay?" she asked Clara. Clara nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes." "I'm Marissa Hale," the woman said. "I run here most evenings. I've seen him before. Watching?" She looked at Ethan, then at Ranger, a flicker of awe crossing her face. "You handled that well." Ethan inclined his head slightly. "Thank you for staying." Marissa nodded. "I'll give this to the police. He made his own case tonight." She jogged off, phone still in hand. Ethan turned to Clara. Her hands trembled, but her spine was straight. "It's over," he said softly. She met his eyes. "For him," she replied. "Not for me." Ethan nodded. That was enough. Ranger relaxed at last, tail lowering, body easing as the tension drained away. The park felt different again. Not safe, not yet, but honest. Clara exhaled, long and slow. "I was so tired of being afraid." "You weren't weak," Ethan said. "You were alone." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time since the loss, she felt something settle into place. They turned back toward the river together, the path illuminated by a pale sliver of moon. The investigation moved quietly at first, like frost creeping across grass before sunrise. Ethan learned about it the way most things happened in Bozeman, through fragments. A nod from a park worker who suddenly recognized him. A pause in conversation at the coffee counter when someone mentioned internal affairs. A patrol car parked outside the municipal building for longer than usual. Clara learned about it more directly. A woman named Dana Kessler met her one morning at a small community office near Main Street. Dana was in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and a posture shaped by years of listening more than speaking. She wore a wool blazer over a soft gray sweater and carried a canvas bag bulging with folders. Her voice was steady, unhurried, and when she shook Clara's hand, she did it at eye level, crouching slightly, so the gesture didn't feel rushed or patronizing. "I work with the Regional Oversight Board," Dana said. "We review misconduct cases, past and present." She didn't rush the conversation. She let Clara speak when she was ready, and when Clara's voice faltered, Dana waited without filling the space. Old complaints surfaced, reports buried under vague language, and administrative excuses. Patterns emerged where once there had been isolated incidents. The officer's name appeared again and again. By the end of the week, his badge was no longer a shield. Suspension came first. Then an official inquiry. Authority stripped down to what it had always been beneath the uniform. Clara didn't attend every meeting. She didn't need to. Knowing the truth was being heard was enough. On Wednesday evenings, she began attending a support group that met in the basement of a brick church just off the river. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Folding chairs formed a loose circle. People came in quietly, carrying stories they'd been told to keep to themselves. The facilitator was Marion Blake, a retired social worker with silver hair pulled into a low bun and eyes that missed very little. Marion had a way of leaning back when others spoke, hands folded loosely in her lap, creating space without demanding it. Here, Clara learned how to talk about her brother without bracing for collapse, how to say his name without losing the ground beneath her. She learned that grief didn't disappear. It changed shape. That strength wasn't measured by how quickly one moved on, but by the courage to remain present. Ethan didn't attend the meetings. He waited outside, leaning against the hood of his truck, or walking Ranger along the sidewalk, giving her privacy without withdrawing support. It was a balance he understood instinctively. He had made his own decision. A week after the park fell silent again, Ethan visited the Gallatin County Search and Rescue Training Yard on the outskirts of town. The place was utilitarian, gravel lots, chain-link fencing, and a low building that smelled of oil and damp canvas. A man named Rick Morano met him at the gate. Rick was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered and weathered, with a salt-and-pepper beard and hands that bore the marks of hard use. He had spent most of his life in rescue work, moving between wildland response and K-9 coordination. "You're the former Navy guy," Rick said, not unkindly. Ethan nodded. Rick watched Ranger move, observed the dog's posture, his attentiveness, the way he checked in without being commanded. Something like approval crossed his face. "We could use someone like you," Rick said. "Training, community response, search dogs, not weapons." Ethan agreed without hesitation. The work filled his days. He taught handlers how to read their dogs, how to trust silence as much as commands. He worked Ranger through scenarios that felt different. No hostile targets, no threat matrices, just people lost, injured, afraid. For the first time since leaving the teams, Ethan felt aligned with the world around him. The town shifted subtly as autumn edged toward its end. Clara's hands grew stronger on the wheels. She took longer routes through town, stopped at places she hadn't visited since before the accident. She volunteered with a local advocacy group that helped people navigate housing access and legal resources after trauma. It wasn't easy work. Some nights she returned home exhausted, emotionally spent. But she returned. Riverside Greenbelt changed too. The leaves thinned, exposing bare branches against the pale sky. The air grew sharper, cleaner. The path near the river, once heavy with shadow, brightened as the season stripped away excess. One afternoon, Clara rolled along the trail alone, her coat unbuttoned despite the cold. She moved steadily, her posture upright, gaze forward. When she reached the bend, she paused. Not from hesitation, but from choice. Ranger lay nearby, stretched out in a patch of weak sunlight, eyes half closed. His breathing was slow, content. Ethan stood a few steps behind her, hands in his pockets, watching the river rather than her. No one spoke. Clara inhaled deeply. The cold filled her lungs, grounding and real. She pushed forward again, wheels whispering over gravel. The season did not end dramatically. There were no speeches, no declarations, just accumulation. Trust rebuilt one choice at a time. Strength discovered not in confrontation, but in persistence. As the first snow threatened the edges of the forecast, the park no longer felt like a place of danger. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, a passage, a place where things moved, even when people felt stuck. Clara stopped beneath the trees and turned her head slightly. "Thank you," she said, not looking back. Ethan nodded once. "Any time." Ranger lifted his head, tail thumping once against the ground before settling again. The light faded, the cold deepened, and for the first time since autumn began, it didn't feel like an ending. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly beside someone who has fallen and refuses to walk away. In everyday life, injustice rarely announces itself loudly. It appears in small moments, when someone is isolated, grieving, or powerless, and the world chooses silence. This story is a reminder that real courage isn't about domination or force. It's about awareness. It's about stepping in when something feels wrong, protecting without owning, and offering presence instead of pity. You don't need a uniform to make a difference. You don't need power to be strong. Sometimes being the one who stays is enough to change a life. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who may need to be reminded that they are not alone. Leave a comment and tell us what part of this journey moved you the most. And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe to the channel for more stories about courage, loyalty, and the quiet strength that saves lives every day.